What if everything you thought you knew about safe and effective vaccines wasn't the whole truth? Imagine discovering that the very organizations we trust to protect public health may also profit from the products they endorse. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's a reality few people dare to question. Science is supposed to thrive on debate, disagreement, and scrutiny. Yet in recent years, anyone who raised legitimate concerns about vaccines was immediately silenced and labeled as spreading misinformation. But here's the real shocker. Misinformation no longer means false. It simply means anything that challenges authority. Welcome to the Nutrition Institute, a place where we dig deeper, ask uncomfortable questions, and explore what others won't tell you. If history has shown us anything, it's that the drugs once praised as safe often turned out to be deadly. So, how much of what we're told today is the unfiltered truth, and how much is carefully managed perception? Stick with me, because in this video, we'll uncover the hidden flaws in vaccine testing, the conflicts of interest in global health organizations, and why the biggest issue isn't science at all, it's ethics. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to the Nutrition Institute so you won't miss the eye-opening truths we have coming your way. What if the very foundation of trust we place in science was built on something shakier than we'd like to admit? For years, I told myself that science was the one place where truth couldn't be hidden. Equations, experiments, data, these were supposed to speak louder than politics, louder than money, louder than opinion. And yet, the more I looked around, the more I realized that science is not this flawless machine. It is run by people, and people, as history has shown time and again, are deeply flawed. I remember the first time I heard someone call vaccine critic spreaders of misinformation. It wasn't just an accusation. It was a kind of scarlet letter. The phrase carried weight, designed to shut people down without ever considering the substance of their questions. At first, I thought, well, maybe they're being reckless. Maybe this label is necessary. But then I started asking myself, since when does disagreement equal misinformation? Isn't the heart of science built on debate, on challenging what we think we know? Look back at the great scientific breakthroughs in history. Almost every major discovery started as a disagreement with the mainstream. Germ theory, DNA, heliocentrism, the people who proposed those ideas were ridiculed, resisted, even punished. But without their courage to challenge consensus, where would we be today? If those voices had been silenced as dangerous or misleading, the world might still be stuck in darkness. So why, in our modern age, does questioning authority get lumped together with spreading lies? Why does the word misinformation no longer mean false, but instead simply something the powerful don't want you to say? That shift alone should make us pause. The deeper I dug, the more contradictions I found. For example, the organizations we're told to trust as the ultimate guardians of health, the World Health Organization, and the Centers for Disease Control aren't as neutral as they appear. On paper, they sound untouchable, global authorities dedicated to protecting humanity. But behind the curtains, things look less pure. The CDC actually holds patents on vaccines and collects royalties. That means the same body responsible for guiding public health is also financially tied to the very products it promotes. Tell me, how is that not a conflict of interest? If a referee in a football game was secretly betting on the outcome, would we trust the fairness of the game? And yet, this is the reality we live in. We're told to trust the science, but what does that really mean? To me, trusting science should mean trusting the process, the rigorous experiments, the transparency, the willingness to publish failures as openly as successes. But what we're often being asked to do is something very different. We're asked to trust institutions, to trust authorities, even when their financial incentives are glaring. That is not the same thing as trusting science. It gets even murkier when you look at how vaccines are tested, especially those given to children. In most drug trials, a new drug is compared against a placebo, something inert like sugar water or saline. That way, researchers can clearly identify what side effects come from the drug and what doesn't. Seems obvious, right? But that's not how many childhood vaccines are tested. Instead of comparing a vaccine against a harmless placebo, they often compare it against another active vaccine, sometimes one that contains aluminum adjuvants designed to stimulate the immune system. Imagine trying to test the safety of whiskey by comparing it to bourbon, and then concluding whiskey must be fine because bourbon caused the same amount of liver damage. That's not science at sleight of hand. When I learned about this, it shook me. The phrase safe and effective is repeated so often that it feels unquestionable. But how can you honestly measure safety if your baseline is another active compound with its own risks? It's like muddying the water before you even begin. No matter what results come out, they'll be interpreted in the most favorable light. And then comes the question of history. How many times have we been told that something was safe, only to discover years later that it was anything but? Vioxx, a painkiller, was widely prescribed until studies revealed it contributed to an estimated 60,000 deaths from heart problems. Paxil, an antidepressant, was promoted as safe for teens until data revealed it increased suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Trans fats were in food for nearly a century before the devastating health consequences were undeniable. Asbestos was considered useful, even harmless, until it was proven to cause cancer. If we could be so wrong, so dangerously wrong before, why are we so confident now that everything we label safe and effective is beyond question? The uncomfortable truth is that the problem isn't just about mistakes. It's about selective disclosure. Studies sponsored by pharmaceutical companies don't always see the light of day. In fact, research suggests that around 87% of industry-funded studies go unpublished if the results don't support the desired outcome. Think about that. The information doctors use to treat patients, the guidelines that shape public health, the very data we base our lives on, much of it could be cherry-picked. Only the good results make it into the spotlight, while the inconvenient truths are buried. So when I hear the phrase, trust the science, I can't help but feel conflicted, because what we're often being asked to trust isn't science at all. It's a curated version of science. It's the story after editing, after PR teams, after financial interests have had their say. And once you realize that, you can't unsee it. What I've come to believe is this: science itself is not the enemy. Data, experiments, replication, those are powerful tools that have given us longer lives and countless innovations. But science corrupted by secrecy and profit is something else entirely. The real problem we face today is not a lack of science, but a lack of ethics. And that realization is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it means we can't blindly accept every claim made in the name of science. Liberating because it shows us that demanding transparency, demanding accountability, is not anti-science. On the contrary, it is the most profoundly scientific thing we can do. In the end, the question we all have to ask ourselves is simple. Are we willing to keep accepting curated truths, or will we insist on seeing the full picture, even if it's messy, even if it challenges what we thought we knew? Because only in that full picture can real trust ever be rebuilt. The more I studied the systems that shape our health policies, the more I began to see cracks in the image of objectivity that we're constantly told to trust. Science, at its core, should be about evidence, replication, and debate. But when institutions and industries intertwine, the waters become murky. Suddenly, it's not just about discovering truth. It's about managing perception. And that's where the story of vaccines, drug testing, and regulatory agencies becomes more complicated than most people want to admit. Let's start with the organizations that sit at the center of global health, the World Health Organization, and the Centers for Disease Control. To the average person, these names carry a sense of authority and trustworthiness. Their statements make headlines, their guidelines shape medical practice, and their recommendations influence governments worldwide. But what happens when these organizations aren't just neutral referees, but also players with financial stakes in the game? The CDC, for instance, holds patents on certain vaccines. That means every time those vaccines are used, money flows back to the very agency responsible for promoting them. Imagine a traffic cop getting a bonus every time he writes a ticket. Suddenly, the incentive changes. What should be an impartial role becomes entangled with profit. It doesn't automatically mean corruption, but it introduces doubt. And in matters of public health, even the appearance of conflict of interest is enough to erode trust. Then there's the question of how vaccines are tested. If you've ever assumed they're studied with the same rigorous placebo controlled trials as other drugs, you might be surprised. In most drug trials, a new medication is compared against something inert, like sugar pills or saline. This allows researchers to clearly see what side effects belong to the drug itself. But when it comes to many childhood vaccines, the control group often receives another active vaccine, sometimes one with aluminum adjuvants meant to trigger the immune system. Think about what that means. If both groups are experiencing reactions, how can we tell which problems come from the vaccine being tested? It's like trying to determine whether coffee or energy drinks cause jitters by comparing one group drinking coffee to another drinking Red Bull. If both groups feel shaky, do we really learn anything about the safety of coffee? This kind of design doesn't give us the clarity we expect from the word placebo. Instead, it blurs the lines. For me, this isn't about being anti-vaccine or dismissing the importance of immunization. Vaccines have saved lives, there's no denying that. But we can't confuse questioning methodology with rejecting science altogether. To ask why vaccines aren't always tested against true placebos is not a rebellious act, it's a rational one. And yet, raising that question often invites ridicule rather than discussion. History gives us plenty of reasons to remain cautious. Time and again, drugs once celebrated as safe were later pulled from the market in disgrace. Vioxx, prescribed widely for pain relief, caused tens of thousands of heart-related deaths before it was withdrawn. Paxil, used as an antidepressant, was later revealed to increase suicidal behaviors in young people. Both were marketed aggressively, both were stamped with the label safe and effective, and both ended up harming countless people before the truth came out. And these aren't isolated incidents. Consider trans fats. For decades, they were everywhere: baked goods, fast food, processed snacks. Industry groups reassured the public. Regulators gave a green light, and for years we consumed them without question. Only later did studies confirm the devastating impact on heart health, leading to bans and reformulations. Or take asbestos, once hailed as a miracle material for insulation and construction. It wasn't until much later that the deadly link to cancer became undeniable. By then, the damage had already been done. If these examples teach us anything, it's that the phrase safe and effective is not a permanent truth. It's a claim subject to change with time and evidence. And when evidence is selectively hidden, when unfavorable studies are shelved, the public pays the price. This brings us to one of the most alarming realities the control corporations have over the flow of scientific information. Studies funded by pharmaceutical companies don't always make it to publication. In fact, nearly 9 out of 10 industry-sponsored trials may never be published if the results don't support the desired narrative. That means the medical community and the public only sees a carefully curated version of reality. Positive findings are broadcast, while negative ones disappear into locked file cabinets. Doctors, policymakers, and everyday people are left making decisions based on incomplete information. Guidelines are written, drugs are prescribed, vaccines are mandated, all while crucial pieces of the puzzle remain hidden. This isn't science in its purest form. It's storytelling carefully managed, heavily edited, and often influenced by those with the most to gain financially. What troubles me most is how normalized this has become. We accept it almost unconsciously. When new guidelines are announced, when a drug gets fast tracked, we rarely ask, where's the raw data? Who funded the studies? What didn't they publish? Instead, we're told to accept the conclusions without question, as though doubt itself is a threat. But science should welcome doubt. It should thrive on skepticism. To question is not to deny it, is to honor the very spirit of discovery. Yet, in today's climate, questioning certain narratives is treated as dangerous. Dissenters aren't invited into discussion. They're pushed to the margins, labeled as irresponsible or misinformed. And that's a tragedy. Because without dissent, science stops being science. It becomes dogma. As I reflect on all of this, I realize that the real danger isn't the existence of flawed studies or even the conflicts of interest. The real danger is our willingness to accept half-truths as whole truths. It's the cultural shift that equates obedience with responsibility and skepticism with ignorance. If we truly want science to serve humanity, we have to demand more transparency, more accountability, more openness to uncomfortable questions, because the moment we allow institutions, corporations, or governments to decide which parts of science we're allowed to see, we've lost the essence of science itself. In the end, the question isn't whether vaccines or drugs are good or bad. The question is whether we, as a society, are willing to confront the uncomfortable possibility that sometimes the very systems we rely on for truth are compromised. That doesn't mean we abandon science. It means we reclaim it. The deeper I went into this subject, the more I realized that the story doesn't end with testing methods or unpublished studies. There's another layer one that doesn't just influence scientific data, but also manipulates how the public perceives it. It's not only about what the research says, it's also about who gets to control the narrative around that research. And that's where something called astroturfing comes into play. Astroturfing is a clever trick. The name itself comes from astroturf, the fake grass used in sports stadiums. Just like fake grass looks real from a distance, astroturfing is about creating the illusion of genuine grassroots support when, in reality, it's orchestrated from above. Corporations and interest groups set up organizations with warm, trustworthy names, groups like Citizens for Patient Safety or Partnership to protect patient health. On the surface, they sound like community-driven efforts. But if you follow the money, you find that many of these groups are funded by the very industries they claim to keep in check. Why does this matter? Because public opinion is powerful. If people believe that everyday citizens and doctors are rallying around a cause, they're more likely to accept it as truth. It feels authentic. It feels safe. But when those voices are scripted, when the grassroots is actually fake grass, it creates a distorted reality. It convinces us that there's a broad consensus, when in fact, the consensus has been manufactured. I find this deeply unsettling. It means that the conversations we see online, in the media, and even in supposed community groups might not be as organic as they appear. It means that what looks like public support could actually be a PR campaign with millions of dollars behind it. And when that kind of manipulation enters the realm of science and health, the consequences are enormous. Take the way certain public figures are discredited. Instead of engaging with their arguments, entire campaigns are launched to label them as unqualified, reckless, or even dangerous. You don't have to agree with those individuals to see what's happening. The point isn't whether they're right or wrong. The point is that their credibility is attacked through coordinated messaging rather than honest debate. And when debate is replaced with PR spin, we all lose. This brings me to what I now believe is the heart of the problem. It's not science that has failed us. It's ethics science, when practiced honestly, is self-correcting. It invites scrutiny. It welcomes challenges. And it grows stronger when its flaws are exposed. But when ethics are compromised, when money, politics, or reputation take precedence over truth, science becomes something else entirely. It becomes a tool for control rather than discovery. Think about it. Data can be manipulated. Studies can be selectively published. Narratives can be shaped through media campaigns. But at the end of the day, none of this is really about whether the science works. It's about whether the people controlling it are honest. And honesty is not a scientific principle. It's an ethical one. That's why I believe the solution isn't simply more science. The solution is radical transparency. Imagine if every study had to publish its raw data, accessible to anyone who wanted to examine it. Imagine if negative results had to be shared alongside positive ones, so we could see the full picture instead of just the highlights. Imagine if financial ties between regulators and corporations were openly declared and limited. That level of openness would make manipulation much harder. It wouldn't solve every problem, but it would shine a light where the shadows are deepest. Transparency would also restore something we've lost: trust. Because right now, trust is at an all-time low. People don't know who to believe anymore: politicians, corporations, scientists, or even journalists. And when trust disappears, fear takes its place. That's when misinformation actually thrives, because people turn to anyone who sounds confident, even if they're wrong. Radical transparency could flip that script. By putting all the data out in the open, it gives power back to the public. It says, here's everything, judge for yourself. I know some people will argue that the public can't handle that level of information, that it's too complicated or too easy to misinterpret. But isn't that a bit insulting? People are smarter than they're often given credit for. And besides, if the concern is that raw data might be misunderstood, then the solution isn't to hide it. The solution is to educate better, to communicate more clearly, to build bridges between experts and the public. At the end of the day, I keep coming back to one thought. The problem isn't that science doesn't work. The problem is that science has been placed in the hands of systems that don't always value honesty. And that's why we need to demand more than slogans. Safe and effective shouldn't be a mantra. It should be a conclusion backed by transparent, unfiltered evidence. So here's the challenge I want to leave with you. Are we truly lacking science in today's world? Or are we lacking ethics in how science is practiced and presented? Because if it's the latter, and I believe it is, then the way forward isn't just to keep repeating what we're told. The way forward is to insist on honesty, to push for openness, and to remember that real science is not afraid of questions. The truth might be uncomfortable. It might even be unsettling. But it's only when we face those uncomfortable truths that we can build a healthier, more trustworthy future. And that, to me, is worth far more than blind reassurance. As I step back and look at everything we've uncovered, one theme stands out. Science itself is not broken, but the way it is handled often is. We've seen how institutions can carry financial conflicts of interest, how studies can be designed in ways that blur the truth, and how public opinion can be manipulated through carefully crafted campaigns. Each of these factors chips away at trust, not just in science, but in the very systems meant to safeguard our health. And yet, I don't walk away from this with despair. I walk away with a clearer understanding. The problem isn't that vaccines or medicines are inherently bad, or that science has failed us. The problem is that honesty has too often been sacrificed for profit, reputation, or control. That distinction matters because it means the solution isn't to abandon science, it's to reclaim it. For me personally, the lesson is simple but powerful. Never confuse authority with truth. Just because a statement comes from a powerful organization doesn't mean it's beyond question. Truth doesn't fear scrutiny. Real science doesn't fear debate. If anything, debate is what keeps science alive and honest. In my own life, this realization has changed how I consume information. I no longer take headlines at face value. I look deeper. I ask who funded the research, and I pay attention to what might not have been published. It doesn't mean I reject all mainstream advice. It means I approach it with the healthy skepticism that science deserves, and I believe that's something each of us can do. Whether it's about vaccines, food, or any other aspect of health, we have the power to ask better questions. So how do we apply this lesson today? By demanding transparency, by encouraging open debate instead of silencing dissent, by remembering that disagreement is not dangerous, it is necessary. Imagine a culture where every study had to reveal its raw data, where regulators had no financial stake in the products they approved, and where public health decisions were based on the full truth, not edited fragments. That world isn't out of reach, but it starts with us refusing to settle for less. At the end of the day, trust will not be rebuilt with slogans or authority. It will be rebuilt with honesty. And that honesty begins when we, as individuals, decide to value truth over comfort, questions over blind acceptance, and transparency over secrecy. So let me ask you this. Do you think the real problem today is a lack of science or a lack of ethics in how science is used? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please share your perspective in the comments so we can learn from each other. And if this conversation resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe to the Nutrition Institute. Your support helps us keep asking the tough questions and uncovering the insights that truly matter. Together, we can build a healthier, more transparent future